Nobody told Colt Maddox what a tire wall could do in winter. Not a shelter worker. Not a social services intake form. Not the man 3 spots down the chain link line who'd been sleeping under the Highway 244 overpass for 6 years and knew Tulsa's cold better than most people who lived inside it. Nobody said it. Nobody passed that piece of information down the way other things get passed, where the warming center opens first, which parishes don't ask questions, which overpasses drain instead of pooling. All of that moved person to person. The tire wall didn't. And that silence cost Colt 2 winters he doesn't talk about much anymore. What they told him, what everyone tells you when you're first sleeping outside in Tulsa, is to layer up, find cardboard, get indoors when the temperature drops to a certain number. That's the advice. That's the full version of it. Cardboard, layers, indoors. Repeated in different orders by different people who mean it and who have probably never spent a night in the kind of cold that moves through cardboard like it isn't there. Cardboard slows wind for about 40 minutes. After that, it's wet and pressed flat and doing almost nothing. Colt learned that in his first week outside and filed it away as one of those pieces of advice that sounds useful because it comes from a source that seems reliable. He was 19 the first winter. He'd been in Tulsa 7 months, coming out of Broken Arrow, which is the suburb directly east, close enough that he could see the city's skyline from certain roads out there, far enough that it didn't feel like the same place. He'd left a situation at home that he's mentioned once in 3 years, and never again. Not dramatically, he mentioned it the way you mention something that explains a fact without needing to become a whole story. He was in Broken Arrow, the situation happened, and then he was in Tulsa. He knew the city the way you know it when you have no particular reason to be inside any of it. He walked. Every block of the inner dispersal loop, the highway overpass network that circles downtown. He knew which direction the wind came from depending on which street he was on. Knew it by feel before he knew it as fact. That Tulsa sits in a corridor where the wind comes hard from the northwest in winter, and that anything tall to the northwest of where you're sleeping is your friend. He knew which parking garages let you stay until 2 a.m. before someone came through with a flashlight. He knew the 24-hour Walmart on Admiral. He knew the hospital waiting rooms that were technically public. He learned all of that in 7 months of walking and watching. The first winter he spent moving. That's the honest version of how he got through it. Not sleeping, moving. He had a sleeping bag, a 30-degree rated bag from a church donation bin on Denver Avenue, and it worked until January. Then January came with 9 days in a row where the overnight low went below 15, 4 of those below 10, and the bag stopped being enough. He wasn't in one spot. He couldn't afford to be in one spot in that cold. He walked until he found somewhere to stop. He stopped until they asked him to leave. He left and walked again. He did that every night for 9 days, and then February broke, and the cold came back up, and he slept for 16 hours straight in the alcove behind a warehouse on North Apache Street that he'd found in the fall. That alcove was the beginning of everything. It belonged to a tire distribution company that had closed 2 or 3 years before Colt ever found it. The building was a long concrete block structure. 1 story, no windows on the back face. The alcove was a recessed loading area, 8 feet deep, 12 feet wide, 3 concrete walls open to the north. There was a chain-link fence around the property with a gap low on the east side that you could step through if you knew where to look. The lot behind the building had old tires in it, worn completely through in some cases, left when the company walked away. Maybe 40 of them scattered around, some in loose piles, some half sunk into the ground from years of rain. Colt found the alcove in October of his first year and used it as a reference point, somewhere to come back to when the night was bad. He spent his second winter there more consistently. He had the sleeping bag, 2 moving blankets he'd pulled from a storage facility dumpster on 11th Street, and a tarp he'd bought second-hand from a sporting goods surplus store for $4. He rigged the tarp across the open north face of the alcove, weighted the bottom with rocks from the lot, angled the top against the concrete wall above the opening. It cut wind significantly. The second winter was also milder. December and January stayed mostly above 20 degrees. He told himself the setup was good. He believed that. The third winter corrected him. December was manageable. First week of January was fine. Then a high-pressure system settled in from the northwest and parked over northeastern Oklahoma for 11 days, and the overnight temperatures dropped into single digits and didn't come back up. Colt had been through cold before, but not like this. Not 11 consecutive days of it in the same spot. By the 7th night, the tarp had been collecting moisture and freezing and thawing and refreezing for a week, and the plastic had gone brittle in a way he hadn't thought about as a possibility. He shifted in the night, normal sleeping movement, and the tarp cracked. He felt it before he heard it. A line across the middle of the plastic, not a tear, an actual crack, the material having become something closer to glass than fabric. The wind, that had been deflected for weeks, came through the gap immediately, and the temperature in the alcove dropped. He was in the far corner with the sleeping bag over his head, and both blankets pulled in, and he stayed completely still, because moving meant losing the small envelope of warmth he'd built up around his body. It was around 2 in the morning. He stayed that way until close to 5. He didn't sleep. He went through the next few hours in a state that isn't exactly awake and isn't exactly asleep. A kind of suspended stillness that your body finds when it's conserving everything it has. When it got light enough to see, he got up and walked around the lot to get his circulation back. He was cold all the way through, in a way that took an hour of movement to clear. He walked laps around the building. He passed the tire piles. And that was the moment. Not a dramatic one. No sudden idea. No clear plan. He stopped walking and stood in front of a stack of 4 tires and looked at them for a long time. He'd looked at them hundreds of times before. This time he was looking at them differently. He was thinking about the concrete walls of the alcove and how they held temperature after the sun hit them. He'd noticed that since he'd first started sleeping there, the south-facing wall, the one that got afternoon sun, was always noticeably warmer to the touch than the wall in permanent shade. Not warm by any useful standard, but warmer. Thicker things held temperature. The concrete was thick. The plastic tarp was not. His cracked tarp was now not even that. Tires were thick. Tires were very thick. He moved one that morning, rolled it from the pile to the open face of the alcove, and set it against the concrete edge. Stood back and looked at it. One tire covering maybe 1.5 feet of the 12-foot opening. He went back and moved another. He spent that entire day moving tires. By the end of the first day, he had a single layer of 10 tires stacked too high across most of the opening. He slept behind it that night, and it was better. Not fixed, but better. The wind through the gaps between tires was broken up, reduced from a continuous draft to something more like intermittent cold pockets. He noticed that the gaps were the problem. One layer of tires, however heavy and thick each tire was individually, was still mostly air when stacked. The gaps between them were open. He thought about that for a day. Then he started building a second row, parallel to the first, 8 inches behind it, leaving a gap between the 2 walls. He moved tires for 3 more days. By the end of the 3rd day, he had the outer row fully stacked, 12 tires wide, 4 tires high, and he'd started the inner row behind it. The gap between the 2 walls he started filling from the top. He used everything he could find in the lot that would compact: loose dirt, gravel, chunks of broken asphalt from a crumbling section of the lot surface, dead leaves packed down hard, more dirt on top. He filled and packed and filled again until the gap between the 2 rows was solid from top to bottom. 43 tires total. He moved every tire that was accessible in that lot. Some he had to dig out of the ground where they'd sunk. One had a tree seedling growing through the middle of it that he snapped off at the base. He moved every one that he could physically roll or carry to the alcove. The entry was the last problem. He'd left a gap on the right side of the wall about 22 inches as the entry point. It was necessary, but it was also an opening, and openings let wind in, regardless of how good the wall was everywhere else. He thought about this for 2 days before he did anything about it. Then he stacked 3 tires perpendicular to the wall, jutting inward from the right side of the entry, creating a short angled corridor. To get inside, you had to step to the right and then turn left, going around the corner of that short inner wall. You had to physically change direction. Wind doesn't change direction. It hits the inner wall and disperses rather than flowing into the shelter. The angled entry was the thing Dennis Reyes talked about the most when he described what he found at that lot. He said it was the detail that told him whoever built this had actually thought about it, not just piled things up, but thought about what the problem was, and solved the specific part of the problem that the piles couldn't reach. Dennis Reyes runs outreach out of the day center on East 2nd Street. He's done it for 15 years. He walks camps, knows names, checks on people when the temperature drops, knows which spots along the river and the IDL have occupied them through multiple winters. He found Colt's spot 8 months after the wall went up. He'd known about the alcove before, had been back there a couple of times in previous years to check on whoever was camping there. He went back because someone on his route mentioned a guy by the warehouse on Apache with a weird setup. He walked through the fence gap. He stood in front of the tire wall for what he said was probably 2 or 3 minutes before he called out. He said it looked deliberate in a way that outdoor structures almost never look deliberate. Most outdoor structures look like they're in the process of being abandoned. This one looked like it was in the process of being maintained. Colt came out through the angled entry. He was 21 then. Full height, not hunched in the way people get hunched when they've spent months bracing against cold. Dennis introduced himself. Colt showed him the wall. He showed him the 2-layer construction and how the fill worked. That it wasn't just dirt, but compacted material, that he'd packed it in layers and tamped it down so it wouldn't settle and leave gaps. He showed him how the tires in the inner wall were staggered from the tires in the outer wall, offset like brickwork, so there was no continuous vertical seam for air to move through. He showed him the angled entry and explained it the way he'd thought about it, that wind moves in straight lines, and if you make the entry not straight, the wind doesn't follow you in. Dennis asked how he'd come up with it. Colt said he hadn't come up with it. He said he thought about what was cold and what wasn't, and built the version that seemed like it would stay warmer. That's not a simple answer, even though it sounds like one, because the advice that circulates, layers, cardboard, get indoors, treats cold like a personal problem. It's about what you put on your body. It doesn't treat the space as something that has properties, something that can be shaped. Colt started treating the space like something that had properties, and once he did that, the space became a material he was working with. The tires were a material, the alcove was a material. He had 43 tires and 12 feet of open face, and the physics of wind movement and thermal mass, and he solved for those things without naming them. The first night in the finished structure, the temperature outside was 19 degrees. Inside the alcove behind the double wall, his water bottle didn't freeze. It had frozen every night that week. He'd been using that water bottle as a rough indicator of how cold it was getting inside. If the water froze, the inside temperature had dropped to 32 or below. That night, it didn't freeze. He doesn't know what the inside temperature was. He doesn't have a thermometer. But the water tells him something real. He woke up from sleep, not from cold, that was new. The 3rd winter ended. He stayed. He spent the summer doing something he hadn't done in the previous 2 summers. He looked ahead, he thought about what hadn't worked, and what could be better. The primary failure point in his original setup was still the top of the wall. The gap between the tire wall and the concrete header above the alcove opening was covered with a piece of plastic sheeting he'd found, and he knew what happened to plastic in sustained cold. He needed something that didn't crack. In July, he was walking past a construction dumpster on Archer Street, 3/4 of a mile from the alcove, and he saw a roll of rubber roofing material sticking out of the top. He pulled it out. It was a partial roll, water damaged on the outer layer but functional underneath. He walked it back to the alcove, a 1/4 mile at a time because it was heavy, leaving it propped against walls while he rested. He cut it to fit the top of the structure with a box cutter he carried, overlapped it onto the tire wall by about 6 inches, and weighted the edges with tires laid flat on top. The rubber overhang kept rain and ice off the entry gap and off the top of the double wall. Rubber doesn't crack in cold. It stays flexible in temperatures well below what Tulsa hits. He's tested that now through 2 winters, and the roofing has not changed. The 4th winter, the one just passed, he had the door. He found out about the door the way he found out about most things. He was paying attention to something while other people weren't. There was a renovation project starting in the spring at a building near OSU Tulsa, a few blocks east of the university campus. He watched it start in March. He knew they'd be demoing interior walls and doors, and that construction debris gets staged outside before it goes in the dumpster. He checked the staging pile every few days, through April. In early May, 4 interior hollow core doors appeared in the pile, leaned against each other by the building's side entrance. He waited 2 days to make sure they weren't going back in. Then he took 1. It was a standard interior door, 79 inches by 32. He needed something that would fit the 22-inch entry gap without blocking it completely. He needed to be able to get out. He borrowed a handsaw from a man at the camp near the river, a man he'd done small favors for over a couple of years, and he cut the door down. He did it on a section of lot near the building, laying the door flat on 2 tires as a sawhorses and cutting it in 2 lengthwise so he had a panel 32 inches tall and 22 inches wide. He carried it back to the alcove. He wedged it into the entry gap. He props it shut at night with a tire pushed against the inside base. A hollow core interior door is not insulation. It's not weather rated. It's not designed for what he's using it for. But a door that covers an opening is a door that stops airflow, and stopping airflow was the last gap in the structure's function. With the door in place, the interior of the shelter on cold nights is as close to still air as he's gotten. Still air warms from body heat. Moving air doesn't. The door was the difference between an interior that slowly warmed and one that stayed connected to the outside temperature. The 4th winter had the coldest stretch since Colt built the wall. Mid-January, 3 nights in a row where the actual temperature, not wind chill, went below 0. The city opened emergency warming centers, and the television news ran the usual coverage of people in coats standing outside them. Colt was in the alcove. On the 2nd of the 3 nights, his water bottle froze for the first time since he'd finished the original wall. The cold was that extreme. He added his sleeping bag, both moving blankets and a Mylar emergency blanket he'd picked up years ago from the finish line of a 5K race that hands them to runners, and he got through the 3 nights. Cold that is uncomfortable, and cold that is threatening feel different in your body. He knows the difference now in a way he didn't when he was 19. The 4th winter's worst stretch was the first kind, not the second. The wall held, the door held, the rubber roof held. The fill between the 2 tire rows, which he repacks every October to compensate for any settling, held. He's 22 years old, and his shelter has beaten 4 Tulsa winters. There is a thing Dennis has said about Colt on the few occasions he's talked about him to other outreach workers. He said most people in outdoor situations are planning for the night they're in. Their horizon is 12 hours, maybe 24. Colt plans seasons. He thinks about July in terms of what October needs, and October in terms of what January is coming. He finds materials before he needs them and stores them. The rubber roofing was found in July and sat beside the structure for 3 weeks before he installed it, because he installed it the right way in a dry spell rather than the first day he had it. The door sat propped inside the alcove for 6 days before he fitted it, because he fitted it on a day when he could do the work carefully, not urgently. That's not how people tend to think about someone sleeping in a tire-walled alcove in North Tulsa, but it's what he actually does. Dennis sent 2 people to see the structure after he found it. Not to move in. The structure is Colt's, and it's sized for 1 person, and that's it. He sent them to see how someone had approached the problem of space. One of those people was a man named Arthur in his late 30s, who'd been camping near the river for 2 winters and had lost 2 toes to frostbite the previous January. Arthur walked back to the alcove and spent about an hour there. He didn't build a tire wall. His situation and the terrain near his camp were different. But he moved his camp to a position with a natural windbreak, and he started thinking about what the space was doing in addition to what his gear was doing. The following winter, Dennis said, was the first Arthur completed without injury. The wall working even when nobody's touching it. Colt doesn't talk about any of this the way someone would if they were trying to explain something significant. He talks about it the way you talk about a practical thing that works. The tone is matter-of-fact in a way that's specific to people who've solved problems with their hands. A kind of ownership of the solution that doesn't need to announce itself. He knows what the structure can do, and he knows what it can't. It can maintain a temperature inside that's survivable when outside is not. It can stop wind. It can keep him dry. It cannot solve what brought him to that lot in the first place. It cannot solve what comes after. Housing, stability, everything that exists beyond the winter itself. He's clear about that. He doesn't frame the tire wall as a solution to his life. He frames it as a solution to not dying in January. That specificity matters, because the thing that makes the wall remarkable isn't that it's impressive. It is, and Dennis and anyone who's seen it confirms that. It's that it does exactly what it was built to do. No more. Colt was cold and in danger. He isn't cold or in danger now, in that particular way, in that particular space. He built the difference. There's a realtor's sign on the warehouse building now. It's been there since October. Colt has seen an agent walk the lot twice with someone who might be a buyer. He watched them from the far side of the fence, staying out of view. He doesn't know what the sale means for the alcove. He doesn't know whether a new owner will fence the back more securely, or demo the building, or use the lot for parking. He's thought about it. He thinks about it more now that winter has passed, and he has time to think ahead again. What he has, regardless of what happens to the lot, is the knowledge. He knows how to build the wall. He knows how far apart the rows need to be to fill effectively. 8 inches is enough to compact solid. Any wider, and the fill takes too long to settle properly. He knows the fill material needs to be varied. Not just dirt, which compresses into voids, but dirt mixed with hard material, gravel, or broken asphalt. So the compression is consistent. He knows the outer row should go up first and the inner row should match it staggered, not aligned. He knows the entry angle needs to be at least a 90-degree turn. A shallow angle lets wind find the gap. He knows rubber roofing, not plastic. He knows a door, even an interior one, over an opening changes the interior temperature profile more than any single other thing he's done. He knows all of that now. He figured it out by doing it, which means he owns it in a way that reading about it wouldn't produce. Dennis said something once, not specifically about Colt, but about the people on his route who make it through years outside without the worst happening. He said the ones who last the longest are rarely the ones with the most resources. They're the ones who stop treating the space they're in as something that happens to them and start treating it as something they can do something about. Colt did not read that. He did not hear it. He sat in a cracked tarp corner at 4 in the morning in 9-degree January cold and looked at 43 tires on a lot in North Tulsa and started moving. If you walk past a pile of used tires, look at them once more than you usually would. Think about the wall they could be. That's exactly where Colt started.